Good morning, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. How is everyone this morning? Good? Wow, that enthusiastic. This will be good. Right, so my name's Sean Cottrell. I'm the founder and CEO of Law in Sport. I'm going to be chairing this panel on, which is essentially going to address, is there, or I'll try and answer the question, is there a doping problem in football, and if so, to what extent? On the panel, I am joined by a distinguished collective of speakers representing different stakeholders. Yeah, I'm a bit of a suck-up, so I apologise for that. So to my left, we have, I'm going to say Dr. Dr. Matt Brown, who's a team doctor at Man City, who looks after a whole bunch of the different requirements around anti-doping, who will go into a little bit more detail later on. We have Kendrah Potts, who is an anti-doping and sports lawyer, who's just soon to be formerly of Michigan DeRea, going to 4 News Square to be a barrister or a door tenant and to do a lot of advocacy. Then Michele Verroken, to her left, who is the founding director of Sporting Integrity, has a distinguished career in anti-doping, was heading up anti-doping at UK Sport before basically the precursor to, in a role precursor to UK anti-doping. And to her left, we have Emilio Garcia, who is the Director for Integrity at UEFA, who looks after anti-doping programs as well as other issues around integrity, such as match fixing and disciplinary issues. So to just get everyone a bit more lively, can we just give everyone a round of applause? I know I haven't done anything yet, but just kind of, thank you. That's the highlight of the panel, so we can go. No. But to start off with, well, I'll say some ground rules actually first. So we would like audience participation. It's quite hard to see everyone in there. If you have any questions throughout the panel, please raise your hand. I'll try and come to you. Just wave it about if I don't see you the first time. However, if you do make a statement, we'll ask for questions rather than statements. If you do make a statement, I'll give you a little bit of time to sort of find yourself. But if you go too long, I will stop you. I'm a bit rude like that, so apologies in advance. To start off, Emilio, I'll just go straight to the point. How much of a problem is there with doping in football?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the question, but the answer is difficult. But I have to admit that looking at the figures, the official figures published by the World Anti-Doping Agency, also by FIFA and UEFA, at least in the territorial competence of UEFA, UEFA Champions League, UEFA Europa League, European competitions, I could say that the problem is limited. You know, we are dealing with between 3-5 cases a year at UEFA competitions. Most of these cases are linked with recreational drugs, social drugs. So, for instance, I'm free to speak about public cases. The case of the player Ermenko is for having consumed cocaine. So, you know, and we are dealing with some other cases linked again with social drugs. So we conduct more or less 3,000 doping tests a year over all UEFA competitions, particularly UEFA Champions League, UEFA Europa League. 1/3 of these tests are out-of-competition tests. We have a strong anti-doping program. And again, looking at the figures, the official figures published by WADA and UEFA, I consider that the problem is limited. Of course, we have the program in place. We need to fight against this cancer, this lacra. But in principle, I could say that the problem is more on the side of recreational drugs, social drugs, rather than in real problems with football players. No? As you know better than me, football is a modality with 11 players. It's not like other, it's a team sport, and it helps a lot in this fight. No? So there are a lot of factors around football that we can consider that doping is, in principle, a limited problem, of course.
And obviously, you've only got oversight of or responsibility for looking after your competitions. So that's as you said, the club competitions at European level and the international competitions. Out of those, I think you said 3,000 tests. Are they blood tests, athlete biological passports?
Well, right now we are doing everything: biological passport, blood, and urine. So, you know, not only in competition, out of competition. So we have signed more than 28 contracts with anti-doping agencies all around Europe. So we have a very good coordination with these anti-doping agencies. So that means that all in all, bearing in mind the activity of the anti-doping agencies at national level and UEFA's anti-doping program, we have to say that we are, of course, we cannot underestimate the problem, but we are happy with the outcome, with the results, and again, the figures are there, are public, the cash cases are there, are public, and I think that we are doing a good job in this area. We are happy or satisfied at least.
Thank you. Obviously, the risk is, and I think you probably want to come in on this, the risk is that sometimes the numbers don't often reflect what's going on in reality because of some of the limitations around it, as we've seen in many other sports, such as the usual example, cycling, athletics. So, Kendrah, did you want to
Actually, I was just going to come in on this idea that it's a team sport and therefore the risk is lower. And I think we all sort of bought into that for quite a long time. But if you look at rugby, that has got quite a lot of problems with drugs in the sport, and obviously that the strength and the hitting that's involved lend itself to doping. I just wondered whether as football becomes more and more physical, it's something that worries you more and more?
Yeah, might be, of course, but I'm not saying that, bearing in mind that football is a modality played by 11 players, the problem is not there. So as you say, I think that the problem is lower than in other sports, but the problem is still there. This is why we invest 5 million euros in the whole anti-doping program every year. This is why we conduct whereabouts and we conduct out-of-competition tests. Of course, the problem is there. We cannot underestimate the problem. But all in all, bearing in mind the figures, even if, as you say, sometimes it's not 100% accurate, we are satisfied with the performance and with the outcome of the whole anti-doping program, of course.
And so, following up on Kendrah's point, that's one of the things that's quite interesting in football, given the stakes are so high, the rewards can be quite high. The selection processes, particularly at a junior level, for, say, for example, where coaches are measuring on sprint speed, on duration, and impact that it has. Much like in rugby and other sports where at a younger age it seems that there's a higher prevalence of doping at least to try and get into the elite squads. I'd be really interested, for Matt, from your perspective, about how you're looking to address that issue at Man City. Is that a risk that you see, as in some of the youngsters coming through? And if so, what are you doing to try and to address it?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I've been at Man City for nearly 8 years now, and I work from everyone from the first team down to the under-9s at the academy. And I think the key thing for me is what I don't want to do is wait for people to get to 18 when they suddenly get to the age that they can be tested by the anti-doping people. So what we do is we get in at a much earlier age. We speak to both the player and the parents as well. I think, as Emilio and Kendrah have already said, quite often the drugs that do show up in our tests are illegal drugs, recreational drugs, and also supplements as well. And I think we're going to talk a bit more about supplements shortly, because to me that's quite a big issue. But I suppose the title for this talk is doping a problem in football, and I agree completely with Emilio that compared to other sports, that our numbers are actually look quite positive. But there are still doping does happen. If you look on the UK anti-doping website at the moment, I think there's 2 footballers who have sanctions against them at the moment. FIFA produced their figures from last year. I think it was 36,000 tests. And I think 0.02% of those came back as an abnormal result, basically. So again, these are very, very low figures, but the fact that it's happening means to me that it is a problem. One thing that I want to talk about as well is at Man City last year, this has been in the public domain, so obviously I can comment slightly about it, but we had a sanction against us because of a whereabouts situation. And for those of you that don't know, in football, obviously we're governed by the Football Association, and it is quite strict that every single week us as a club needs to update the Football Association about where our players are going to be. We need to tell them daily what time they're training, where they're training, how many of them are going to be training. If they're in the gym in the afternoon, we have to tell them that as well. So it's quite a strict system that we need to update. Now, this is for sort of national level. If we then go with what Emilio deals with at UEFA, if any of these players play in the Champions League, both at the first team level and the under-19s, we also need to update the UEFA whereabouts system. We had some issues last year, and these issues can be quite variable, but even if it's something like there was a player due to train in the afternoon, but I sent that player home ill, if that information is not updated on the whereabouts system immediately, and the drugs, the anti-doping people arrive, and that player is not here, then that is a warning. And you're allowed to have 3 of those warnings within a 12-month period, and then.
Well, I think so. I'll come back to the. I think I would like to get into the supplements side of things, because it's just interesting. From there's obviously a lot of advertising around supplements in sport, and athletes often feel they need to use it. But on the whereabouts side, on the administrative side, I think it's. I'm not sure how knowledgeable people are about anti-doping in the room, but there's often when a failure of any or someone's found to have been, or someone is sanctioned for an anti-doping violation of any sort, they're labelled as dopers generally. I know it's slightly different on the administrative side, but on that administrative side, how much of a problem is that, and are people up to speed with finding these whereabouts requirements, particularly Emilio, from your perspective, and how much do you think that if we're looking at the doping problem in football? Because if you look at, say, for example, with issues around Russia, a lot of that was around the administration, the errors and acceptability of a doping regime was in the administration.
Yeah, well, I will refer to the supplements issue, and of course, from my legal understanding, right now it's a big problem. We faced 2 serious cases last year. It's the case of Sacco. Mamadou Sakho is a clear case of use of this type of substance. It was a problem. In the end, the player was acquitted by the UEFA disciplinary committees, but the problem started by means of these supplements, problems with supplements. And last year, I'm speaking about public cases, the case of the Macedonian player Ademi, playing at UEFA competitions. We imposed 2 years ban. It was more or less the same problem, use of supplements. Right now, it's a big problem. I think that the clubs are very well aware that it's a problem as well for them, and they need to be extremely careful with these all external advisors, doctors, because this is the main problem. I think that if the players are playing within the chain of the club, so under the supervision of the club doctors, under the supervision of really experts coming from the club, it's not a problem. But as soon as they are leaving this area, as soon as they are going to superstars in their respective countries, supplements are really right now a big problem, and we are concerned about this problem. And then, from a strictly legal point of view, when you face a case, the case is extremely difficult, because most likely, sometimes it was a mistake of the player, so the product was contaminated, and then you need to go for a very strict sanction. So, even from a human perspective, sometimes when you are dealing with these cases, it's really, really difficult for the disciplinary committees.
So probably, Michele, would you just like to, just for the benefit of everyone in the room, because we just assume, please, if anything's not particularly clear, we're talking about an issue you'd like to know more, please put your hand up. But from a supplement side, can you just explain what the risk is for supplement? Because I think, again, a lot of the narrative around it, so sometimes the coverage can be a little bit misleading at times, or difficult to follow.
Good morning. Supplements, to me, it's a problem that could easily go away, but there's been a reluctance of governments particularly to actually deal with this. We're talking about products really that fall between the Medicines and the Food Act, and for the most part they tend to suggest that they can make physiological changes to the body, which means actually they should be licensed as medicines. And to be honest, I don't understand why governments don't just actually legislate on them, and the problem would go away in many respects, because then the issue of strict liability that applies to doping offences in all sports would actually be one of more reality.
So for those who aren't familiar around doping, that's the strict liability principle.
Strict liability means if it's there, we start treating this as a violation and start to take it through the disciplinary process. And certainly, even if you did not intend to improve your performance, intended to cheat, the very fact that you've taken a prohibited substance, which you may not even realise is in a supplement, because they're unregulated, they may not be clearly labelled, they may be contaminated. Certainly, going back in time, and regrettably I've been around far too long to see too many athletes, too many footballers fall foul of these particular doping regulations. And once it's there, it really does take then the power of a legal argument to reduce the sanction, but it won't necessarily excuse you from a sanction. So, and the difficulty is in sport generally, and in football in particular, that supplement companies are very keen to offer sponsorship deals And some obviously do have a reputable background. The question, of course, is whether or not the footballers actually need this, because if they had a basic sort of normal diet, and most football clubs now would have provided, support nutrition, where the players are actually eating in the club and no longer visiting the burger bars and the they're actually eating in the club. So, nutrition has changed around football clubs, but perhaps, unfortunately, the mystique about being able to supplement your diet and therefore make yourself better still exists. So if an athlete, if a player takes a supplement and it contains a prohibited substance, if it's found in their urine, certainly that is the start of a charge of an adverse finding, an anti-doping rule violation.
So on the supplement point, and I know we spoke about this after, so I thought it's worth getting into, that say whether it's Sacco or one of these other cases where, Matt, maybe you could just talk about how athletes, the professional footballers, could seek outside advice for whether it's strength and conditioning, whereas for nutrition, because I think in other sports, and Kendrah, maybe you want to talk about some of the stuff in cycling that you're involved with, the Cycling Independent Reform Commission, but the acts of those third parties and how reliable those third parties are to take advice from, is that something that you have to sort of work with the players? And you mentioned, which I thought was fantastic, your work with, which maybe you can allude to as well, what you do with parents, but how you give them advice about how, whether or not this third party is reputable and can be trusted.
Yeah, well, I think the problem is sometimes these can't be trusted. That's the problem, and I agree completely. If we could get rid of supplements, then the anti-doping violations would be reduced, in my opinion. I think as a club we tend to we educate the players, and look, we tell them, for the best for their career is to avoid supplements. But the problem is, can you police that? And I think the answer is no. So what we do is, if they are adamant that they are taking supplements, and by the way, the club do provide supplements in terms of vitamin D and omega-3 fish oils, regulated things like that. That's obviously fine. But it's these things that you can buy off the internet. And like we were saying, does it say what's on, what's inside? Does it actually say that on the label? And the chances are it doesn't. There is a website called Informed Sport where athletes can go on, and what that company does is they batch test different supplements. So they can, I don't think they can 100% guarantee, but they are pretty confident that those supplements are safe. But I think we just try to get the players to stay off them. The problem is when we've got some quite high-profile international players that might go on loan abroad. At Man City, we have clubs internationally. So if we have a player that's been over to New York, and there's an elite player in New York who's using a certain supplement, and they're told, oh, this is fine in the United States, they come back to the UK, it may not be fine. So I just get them to run everything, whether it's medication or whether it's supplements, by myself and the nutritionist within the club.
I think is the problem one of definition, because a player who's just trying to get good nutrition and therefore is regarded as a doper is not necessarily intending to cheat. In some respects, doping then catches people who are definitely cheating and lumps them in with players who are stupid, ill-advised, make mistakes, and that is one of the problems of trying to define whether there's a problem or not, because you're lumping so many other things in together. And also, illicit recreational drug use. If there's a 40% use in society, why wouldn't there be a certain level in football? It's less than society, which speaks a lot for sport, but it doesn't help us with the reputation.
Kendrah, you go first, but we'll come back to the recreational drugs, because I think that's a separate, something we can deal with discreetly.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things about football is the division of responsibility, actually, because you've got this team sport, and football players are well known to be a lot more sort of mollycoddled, is probably the best word, than individual athletes, for example. Individual athletes have to sort out their own travel, and they go around the world, and they might have coaches or trainers to help them. But at football clubs, players they're regulated in pretty much everything they do, and I think that's going to be one of their problems. Michele was talking about, if you take a contaminated supplement, then you then have to show that you meet one of the criteria to be able to benefit from a reduction in the sanction, okay? And Emilio also mentioned, are you taking something on the advice of a team doctor? Well, I think the really interesting thing is actually in football that if you were to ask any professional footballer, if they are given something by their club and they take it, and it happened to have a prohibited substance in it, are they in any way at fault? And I think most of them would probably say no. And the really interesting thing is I'm not sure that that would hold up, actually. If they blindly followed what their club gave them.
Essendon, which,
which is
slightly different. They didn't blindly.
Slightly different. They didn't well, they will.
So can you just explain sort of the Essendon, because I think it's one of the biggest cases in team sport over the last few years that I think it'd be worth highlighting the risk to in football.
Over in Australia, an Aussie Rules team, this was rather than football, and they had a sports scientist who effectively set about to inject the whole team with a variety of supplements, including one substance that is a prohibited substance. And this went through various levels, and CAS, in fact, banned 34 of the players for 2 years. And what CAS said in the end was, and only 6 of those players turned up to give evidence before CAS, so it couldn't consider all of them. But it effectively said, you knew you were being injected with things, you didn't pay any attention to what it was, you haven't showed up to tell us why you took any care in what was being administered to you, so you do not meet the standard to show no significant fault or negligence, and therefore you get what was at that time the standard sanction of 2 years. So it just comes back to this whole idea of who can you trust. You know, as a footballer, you can't blindly just take what you're given. You know, if you're given that by a nutritionist, have you gone and done the adequate research on the internet yourself? Have you also spoken to a doctor? And of course, these cases are fact specific, but I think a lot of people would say if you had checked with a nutritionist, checked online, checked the company, checked the list, you've probably gone quite a long way to meeting that threshold. And there's a case not actually in football, but in athletics, where they had done exactly that, and they still got 4 and 6 month bans. And you know that could be the rest of a season for a football player. So it can be quite significant.
When you speak, I was on a call with a sort of St Gilson with an elite athlete who, funny enough, just got a medal following the Russian situation, and their view on their general listening to some other anti-doping experts talking was, you know, I never intended to dope, therefore I didn't even pay attention to the antidote. And I'm sure in football it's a similar thing. There's a bunch of people who literally just think their level of awareness is not that great. Let's go, well, I don't have to be concerned about this. And that's probably quite a significant risk factor.
Or if they even if they aren't getting what they want from the club, the other risk factor is, and you were saying this, you know, the club doesn't want to give them too many supplements, and you give them just the regulated ones. If they want to go out and find something else, that's when they then start going to the gyms and turning to the black market. And at that point, the risk increases again, both in terms of the likelihood of it being contaminated and the chances of being able to reduce the sanction.
So I'd actually argue that actually there's no such thing as a regulated supplement. I think what we need to do is divide vitamins and minerals from all this other nonsense that claims it's going to do these wonderful things to your body, the fat burners, the energy drinks, the weight reduction, and then obviously one of the bigger problems generally in sport is sexual enhancement. And it's, you know, it's absolute nonsense. And so that's why I say I can't understand why governments don't just legislate, and that would make this problem go away. But the problem is intent. There may not be any intent, and how many players say, well, I bought it from a health food shop, it must be okay. And even the testing systems aren't foolproof. We've now got a problem with people adding this logo to products when they don't actually have the batch testing behind it. So we have still have a problem where this is associated with doping. So doping by cheating, by using hormone products, EPO, all the other things that are actually about improving performance are getting really mixed up, and reputations are being damaged as a consequence. And I think the trouble is...
Sacco case being one of the...
Sacco case is a case in point. And here's a situation where even the anti-doping regulators did not know whether or not the substance should be on the list or not. Now, how does that help for the certainty of players or doctors or advisors?
Because we can start to go into the twos and fro's of that, which we probably inevitably end up doing about the World Anti-Doping Code and WADA and the constructs of that. But so just to clarify, so the question of the panel obviously is there a problem in football? And would I be right in saying then from the panel's perspective that you say, well, there is an issue like any other sport with doping, as in there are people who are going to be intentionally doping, but the other major real issue in football is actually these supplement issues or a lack of education rather than an intention to cheat. Would that be your assessment, or do you think,
I'd say we just don't know what the problem is, to be honest, and if people did speak honestly about it, but there's, and I'm looking at this having spent a lifetime in this and 20 years at UK sport, developing from the introduction of testing to football in the days of Graham Kelly and sort of a voluntary program, believe it or not, and to even look at the situation where Rio Ferdinand, he had a 1 strike and was out. Now it would be 3 strikes at least, so it's a different situation, but we really don't know what the size of the problem is for sport, but there is a huge industry, an anti-doping industry, that can't help us with the answer either.
I mean, it hasn't yet had the scandals that has hit cycling and athletics, where it's just considered to be pervasive in the sport. I mean,
Or
the
in a
closest
club.
it's come has obviously been the Juventus one, which was years ago now, where team doctor was, again, injecting players. And Michelle's right. Is that because we don't know about it, or is that because it isn't happening? What we know is that we haven't had that yet, the sort of intentional team, deliberate doping, the sort of Lance Armstrong style, versus what we do know is that football faces the same problems as everyone else with contaminated supplements. And let's face it, all professional athletes are taking supplements of some form because they feel the need.
So I think I'm right in saying this. There were some issues around certain football clubs in Spain associating with certain doctors who had a reputation for being involved in certain activities. I think that's been reported, I should say. Just right about dropping myself in it here, but I believe that was alleged at least. I'm not sure if I can't remember off the top of my head now if there was actually any cases brought against that. And obviously we've got there's huge question marks over Operation Porto and the blood samples and what's going on with that.
I think the key thing, there is people within sport who want to enhance the performance of athletes, and whilst those people exist, then it is a risk for football.
So on that point, these third parties, which in, again, sports like athletics and cycling we see, do you feel, Emilio, from your perspective, that you have sufficient jurisdiction over these third parties or even oversight?
Well, obviously, from a strictly legal point of view, we don't have competence over third parties. So we have competence over clubs, football players, team doctors. But when it comes to third parties or advisors, we need to collaborate with the police. For the first time, and now in UEFA, we have a specialized unit, not only with anti-doping, also with investigations. So, a former Europol officer joined the company 3 months ago. He will be focused not only in match fixing, also in anti-doping. So it's a step for us in terms of investigation. As you say, sometimes, all these external companies, individuals are away from our jurisdiction, so we cannot open proceedings, but what we can do is to collaborate with the local authorities, the case of Spain, Italy, France, and the Netherlands, through the appropriate persons. And in this sense, so with the new Europol colleague, now joined the company a few months ago, so we are stronger in this field. But of course it's complicated, so this is a global phenomenon, no? I agree with you, of course. It should be a good idea if the states go ahead with something about supplements. But at the same time, it's a global phenomenon. So even if in United Kingdom, Spain, Italy, Switzerland, the states go ahead with this policy, then you can buy supplements via internet with 1 click. So in Malaysia, in United States, in Argentina, so the problem is really, really difficult. And for me, again, the answer is doping a problem in football? I would say, looking at the figures, we have to be comfortable, but of course, we cannot underestimate the problem. The problem is there. And for me, the two main problems are first, supplements, and the second problem in doping for me is, and this is something that we are working on, is sometimes it's hard to say, but the lack of respect towards the players, in the sense that when we have a doping case, everybody thinks that, well, the player is guilty. This is the case of Sacco. So, you know, he was tested positive. Everybody thought, well, the guy is guilty. And this is something that we are trying to change, at least at UEFA. No? So for the first time, we have just introduced public hearings for doping cases. This is completely new. So, you know, well, we don't need to hide anything. So if we face a doping case, the hearing will be public. Then we have just implemented pro bono consuls, and also the proceedings will be free for the players, because we need to guarantee that doping cases are really fair, not only for UEFA, but also for the players.
So just on that point, I'm not sure if everyone who are not familiar with the legal sort of terminology, but one of the barriers to, I think really what you're identifying is sort of access to justice and right to a fair hearing.
Yeah, right.
Is that it can be very expensive to get anti-doping lawyers in, and some people may have the actual means to do it, but some of the lower end players may not have the means or even know who to do it. So you're saying UEFA will assist with that?
Yeah, this is the idea. No, this is not the case of Sacco, because he hired very good lawyers and experts. But when we deal with some of the cases, so social drugs, especially with women's or under young players, so it's a bit unfair that we have everything, WADA has everything to win the case, and then we impose 2 years ban on a player who doesn't know anything about doping or how to defend himself.
And it can
so
get,
for me,
it
this
get
is
very expensive, can't it? Particularly if you go to CAS. So that you have to pay, I always get this wrong, I feel like 20,000 Swiss francs or something, is that right? Or I think it's fund.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But it's still not cheap, and particularly if you've got to fly out to Switzerland and so forth to actually represent yourself. I think, well, I commend you for those changes, because no doubt you're restricted in sort of what you can do because of the hierarchy and the WADA code and how that operates. So you can only, there's only a certain amount of new changes that you can make. So I think that's excellent. I know you've been publishing more cases as well, which is also helpful for access to justice. Coming back to the recreational drug policy, though, do you think that, say, for example, in rugby or the AFL, which we discussed, and I think someone else mentioned earlier, Paul mentioned earlier, we were speaking of the NHL, they've got the same thing, whereas if you, because of youngsters being so more exposed to and vulnerable at that age to experiment or be encouraged maybe even by some senior players, and that's what happened in rugby, to take these illicit drugs, they have a one strike and then you're out. So it's basically private. If you fail a test for illicit substance, they put you on a rehab plan, essentially. The clubs are not informed about it. And then if you fail another test, then it's disclosed to the public. Do you think...
So you have to distinguish between the in-competition, out-of-competition. So the in-competition, they are prohibited.
I think it's all out of competition.
Out of competition, exactly. That's when they have what we call these social drug policies, which can be the one strike or other sports 2 strikes and fines. And it's effectively treated as misconduct rather than anti-doping rule violation. And obviously sports have decided that actually it is incumbent on them to try and help athletes and protect their health. I think the most difficult thing actually with the illicit drugs is an education point around this in competition and out of competition, because I think that's very confusing actually for players, and I don't think many people actually would know how long metabolites of those substances would stay in their system. So one case that I was involved in, this was actually a quite low-level player, took cocaine on a Saturday night out. It was pre-season, didn't think he was going to be playing again until the following Saturday. Tuesday was going to be pre-season training, wouldn't have been caught. Suddenly, pre-season training turned into a pre-season friendly and was tested, and the metabolite was still in the system. And suddenly, you're out for 2 years. And again, that's a lack of education. Had he realised it was still in his system, he probably wouldn't have played. But also, people just don't think about it. They're thinking, I'm taking cocaine on a Saturday night out with my mates. Whatever people think about that being right or wrong, that's very different from a sporting sanction, which the 2-year ban is.
I think that's an inadequacy of the rules in many respects, and I'm sorry because, I stand back and look at this, and I work with another professional sport, and those players have just decided to have one list all the time so that we can actually properly police what's going on, because certainly when you look at a drug like marijuana, how does that make you a better footballer, for crying out loud? And it is really difficult because the anti-doping regulations have altered very quietly, and the level of detection has been raised so that it should only be on the day use of marijuana. Now, no one wants a footballer high on cannabis on a pitch likely to do some damage to somebody else, and that's where the penalty should apply. Now, I'm not at all advocating that then they should be allowed to use it at other times, but regrettably the rules kind of suggest that. They suggest that cocaine should be a drug of choice because the clearance time is much quicker than it would have been for cannabis at the level previously detected. And this isn't a good message to be sending to anybody involved in sport, let alone football.
In that sport, though, do you think within football, and I know that how the wider code and the prohibited list, so that's the list of substances and methods that are prohibited, are derived, are categorically influenced by politics. They may not always be related to performance enhancement. Do you think we're going to see team sports such as football and particularly the players and the player associations and FIFA and the like challenge that system and say, hey, this shouldn't apply because it's actually damaging the reputation and
I think the clubs as businesses should be also getting behind UEFA and challenging that, because the players are the employees of the club. There is a duty of care over the employees to be covered by an illicit recreational drugs policy where you can actually offer clinical assessment and rehabilitation and not actually penalise people for what could actually be a medical addiction problem. So I think there's a need to really refocus the rules here. But, you know, I would say that, wouldn't I? Because I kind of come from the...
It's a complex matter, so I partially agree with you, but at the same time, and it's not a statement, a political statement, but, you know, the football players, they play an important social role in our lives. So in the life of my daughter, in the life of my boy, your family. So, you know, Cristiano Ronaldo, Messi, you know, they identify like real stars. So, you know, if we allow football players to use marijuana or cocaine out of competition, I think that is, you know, it's not a good idea because they are models for everyone at worldwide level.
But presently the rules allow that, you see. That's that's the hypocrisy. The rules allow that, and the rules should just say no. It's banned at all times. And then that's clear. I agree with you, but I just think the rules don't allow us to...
So on top of that, it goes back to education for me, getting in with the parents especially, because you try and influence a 20-year-old player, or especially an elite player now who's, you know, top of his game, they're not... Sometimes they don't listen to us, as simple as that.
How receptive do you find the parents?
Very, very, very perceptive, right. Yeah. So I get in at a very young age because to me it is crazy. There's this online internet-based thing called Global DRO. So I tell any player who is about to take any medication, whether that's a tablet over the counter from Boots the Chemist or whether it's something else, they go online and it tells them, is it or is it not allowed to be taken? And if you type in cannabis onto that, it says that you are not allowed to take it in competition, but there's a nice green tick for out of competition. So to me, that's telling players that when it's pre-season, they can pretty much do what they want.
What's really interesting, just to play devil's advocate on that for a second, a blanket ban would obviously be easier and much more straightforward from an education perspective. I just question whether that's justified from the perspective of an anti-doping rule violation, because what you were saying is you don't want people who are high on drugs who can cause injury. Fair enough, so it should be an anti-doping rule violation to be taking it in competition. But out of competition, what you're saying, Emilio, actually, is it's to do with being role models, and therefore actually that's not really a sporting performance-related rule violation. That is misconduct, and that's actually what a lot of sports have done. So the FA, for example, rugby, cricket, most sports now are now introducing this social drugs policy, and if you are caught taking it out of competition, it is a misconduct violation. And what they then do is, you know, the first time you might get fined or you might not get fined the first time, the second time, but you were also referred to counselling, for example. So rather than just sanction people who are doing this, they're trying to help people. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily the wrong approach for recreational drugs.
Maybe.
No, I think you're right. But the trouble is you get those kind of cases lumped in with the possibility that certain doctors are boosting the blood of players so they can run 90 minutes at the same speed.
It's a lack of definition, isn't there? Because everyone just lumps everyone as a doper rather than having discrete categories for it. I just wanted to pick up on a point that so it seems like there should be more discussion around this, a more mature discussion around it. I know that it's difficult, particularly in a global setting. Like, say, for example, in the States, they've got legalised cannabis in certain states, for example, so it adds to the problem. But you mentioned, obviously, there's global DRO, but there was a bunch of scientists who were talking at a Macalin convention in Switzerland, and they were saying from their perspective as well, one of the problems is, I'm not sure if this is one of the things that you come up on, definitely I know, I think it's a problem for you, is the testing limits. So the science now is so good in the sense of what they're able to test for, they go down to the nanogram of a particular substance, that where it came from can be very difficult for an athlete to prove. And so obviously then they're under strict reliability, so they get a sanction. It seemed to me that that's going to be a risk as the science continues and rolls out over the next years, and as the national federations introduce more stringent anti-doping regimes, that we're going to have more players falling foul of this. So is that something you're concerned about? Is it something from a UEFA perspective that you're going back to WADA and inputting as a stakeholder on that?
Certainly supports Michelle's position that people should just not take supplements and they should be banned.
Yeah, and I'd also sort of point out, FIFA should be applauded for the work they did around the under 23, I think it was, World Cup in Mexico, where they identified clenbuterol, a hormone in the food chain, and every team, bar the host nation, tested positive. Wow. Something rather strange there, maybe. But why would we apply a strict liability and sanction everybody for something that is not controlled within farming in both Mexico and China? And I think that's where common sense has to apply, but in my experience, it doesn't always apply in anti-doping, and that's what's sadly lacking, I think. But FIFA did a fantastic job in that respect.
So, Emilio, from your perspective, is this something that, when you're looking at there are our latest rounds of consultations with WADA, is this something that you're in constant contact with them about, or how do you approach it?
When I have to say that when we deal with doping cases, we take the case very seriously. So it's not, again, a statement. So, especially my unit, when I see a player and I receive the report from laboratory, my first point is, now we need to demonstrate that the player is cheating. So it's not the opposite. So I had the guys, when it came to my office, no, this is positive, 2 years ban. So I'm sorry. For the moment, we have a positive report from the laboratory, and now the inspector, the UEFA inspector, has to prove that he's in breach of the regulations. So this is why we introduce these measures. And of course, it's a problem, but again, when we deal with these cases, we take these cases very seriously, and when you impose 2 years ban on a player, or 4 years ban on a player, or when you exclude the responsibility of the player, this is the case of Sacco, you need to be absolutely sure, because they are really professional football players, so they have family, friends, kids, and it's difficult for us. But again, we take very seriously doping cases, because it's not match behind closed door or 2 matches ban for the Super Cup, Manchester United, and the first match day 1 of the UEFA Champions League. It's the life of an individual. And this is why we are always very, very careful with doping cases. Sometimes we know that we are criticized because, doping cases take time. It's not today and tomorrow you have the solution. This is the case of Sacco. So it took 3 months because the case was difficult and complicated, but in the end, I think that we rendered the right decision.
Thank you. I think that's I'm going to open up to the floor for some questions, if there are any. I did say questions throughout, but I didn't see any hands going up, so I apologise. I probably should have said earlier, because we're going to have to wrap up the panel soon. Are there any questions from anyone? Right, okay, let's go quick fire, so as quick as you can. 1, 2, 3, and then anyone else.
Can I ask a question to Emilio? Kendrah made reference to the Juventus case during the 90s. Would UEFA ever consider revoking the titles that were won during that period?
Nice, easy question.
So, in this regard, I don't have comments, no. So, for the moment, we are not considering this possibility. And even from a strictly legal point of view, I have my doubts that we can do something. But in any case, we are aware of the circumstances, but right now we are not considering this possibility, of course.
Thank you. Sorry, I should say as well. Sorry, there's a mic there, but also just your name and organisation would be good.
Peter Evans. I'm from Amos University, from Paris and London. Just two quick things. The first one was regarding Rio Ferdinand. I think Rio was charged with avoidance rather than whereabouts, and I think there's a difference between the two. My main point, though, is as football got a problem, back in 2015, not that long ago, I understand there was only 2,000 tests done across English football, which, when you average it out, is a very small amount per club. I know there's more in the Premier League than there is in the rest of the divisions, but we are talking on average only 20 tests per club across the English football.
So your question being? Just for
how,
time,
how on earth can football know whether it's got a problem if it's not testing anywhere near as much as it should be?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think FIFA have come up with that statistic, haven't they, and UEFA obviously as well, but we're forgetting about the grassroots. In the Premier League, the UK Antidote last season said, look, there's going to be more tests next season. Players can be expected to be visited at home, because remember, a player can get tested whenever throughout the day. Even 11 o'clock at night, they can turn up at the door. So in the Premier League, that is happening more and more this season. I've seen that personally myself since the start of this season. But again, is that filtering down to the lower levels? And if things are less policed at the lower levels, you know, is that where the bigger issue lies?
So,
just one other thing on it.
Yeah.
Sorry, a third of all Premier League players were not tested in 2015.
I guess one of the counter arguments, though, is about proportionality, which is also about the limited resources. You have to do some targeted, and this is, I think, the point Emilio was saying about the investigations.
I would pick up on, you know, the problem for sport is no one knows how much testing is enough. There are some drugs that you could microdose on and that would be gone within hours. So player may be available up for, and cyclists, whatever, available up until 11 o'clock at night, slap on the testosterone patches at 11:05, and by the time you take them off at 2 in the morning, you'll be clear by the time they might turn up at 5 a.m. So it is about proportionality. One of the regrettable situations is that we don't do enough research on how we're going to really create a far better deterrent. We are still testing with, in terms of urine collection, the same kind of urine collection that we did back at the '66 World Cup. It is time to move on. It is time that the clubs themselves exercise their duty of care for the players. So there's a lot more that we could be doing. And Sean's right. There's such sophisticated analytical evidence available. We just really aren't perhaps making best use of it.
Just for the sake of speed, we've got two questions over there. As the mic's going over, one of the other problems as well, which I find completely, I'm not happy with really, is the fact that we don't know what the long-term effects are of doping still. So like, again, if you're a youngster, you take some steroids or something at the age of 16, you're not really tested that much. What's the long-term impact? So there was a gentleman there. Just name, organisation, and quick question. We have to wrap it up in a few minutes. So
okay, cheers. Andrew Warshaw from Inside World Football. Can I ask Emilio, one of the subjects that you haven't discussed conveniently or otherwise is the Fancy Bears recent hacking leak. Can I ask Emilio for a reaction to the information that Fancy Bears put out, suggesting there was actually a bigger problem in football doping than the authorities might otherwise admit, even though they might perhaps have an ulterior motive for their information? And specifically, would you like to see TUEs in football banned? Thank you.
But it's not the first time that this organization leaks information. So they did some months ago with some of the sports. But as far as we are aware, and we have already spoken to FIFA in this regard, particularly with this information, all this information is linked with therapeutic use exceptions. So, you know, what we know is that they are trying to expand the message that football has a problem, but when you look at the figures, so there are therapeutic use exceptions granted by the respective committees. So this is not an anti-doping rule violation, it's completely different. And it's important to know that there is a difference between anti-doping rule violation and a TUE accepted and granted by the specific committee. So, you know, as far as we are aware of the situation right now, and again, we have already checked with FIFA, so in principle, all this information is linked with the South Africa World Cup 2010, so it's not a UEFA matter. Maybe FIFA is in a better position, but are linked with therapeutic use exceptions granted according to the doctors and to the specific committee.
So Kendrah, did you just want to add something?
Your question about TUEs, I mean, across any sports, but they play a very valuable role because some people need certain medications. I think the bigger issue with TUEs is not banning them altogether, but it's better policing of them. And certainly that came out of the cycling review, is it's not possible that that percentage of cyclists, for example, have asthma. If you look at it compared to the rest of the population, and that is also true across other sports. I think it's just better policing of it.
I just wonder when footballers abused it and actually don't need TUEs perhaps as much as other athletes do.
Sorry, I'm going to have to move it on, but you probably,
Well,
maybe.
I think that
sorry.
it depends on the individual, no? So, you know, for sure at FIFA, but also at UEFA, we have a specific committee in order to deal with these matters. So they are experts. So it's not up to the administration, even to the judicial bodies. So there are 3 experts, 3 doctors, that they analyze these requests. And I can guarantee you that more than 30-45% are refused. So it depends on the case, it depends on the player, it depends on the circumstances.
Thank you,
So,
thank you.
you know.
Thank you, Emilio. So, Rob, do you want...
Hi, Emilio. Hi.
Name, organisation, please.
Rob Harris from
Thanks.
the Associated Press. Just wondering how much progress you're making uncovering the true extent of doping by Russians, given the fact the McLaren report highlighted particularly UEFA games that were involved with the cover-up, and how much you're helping FIFA to uncover the full extent and prosecute people relating to the doping in football that seems to be widespread.
Yes, of course. In this area as well, we are cooperating with FIFA. They have the key contact and the direct contact with the World Anti-Doping Agency because they are signatories of the WADA code, so UEFA is not a signatory, so the main contact for us is FIFA. FIFA contacts WADA and they have the information. What I can say you is that FIFA did it and we did it, so we reanalyze all samples concerning Euro 2012 Russian players, and we did not find any anti-doping rule violation. So following the information from McLaren, the McLaren report, FIFA did it, and they disclosed this information, and we did it, and we were unable to find any anti-doping rule violation on Russian football players. So this is what I can say concerning this issue.
But the issue was never about them necessarily failing tests, because the samples were tampered with, so you wouldn't necessarily know if samples had been tampered with unless you did further research, because they would show they were negative.
Yeah, well, as far as we know right now, so at least at UEFA level, we are covered not only by this sample of the World Euro 2012, also some of the measures that we have implemented with FIFA, and as far as we know, so, you know, we are not suffering from this McLaren report. So.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up there, just because I know Emilio's got to get a flight from London.
No, I'm fine, of course.
Okay,
these are complicated questions, but I don't know if you're happy with the answer.
Well, I'm sure for the other, well, if not for Emilio, then for at least the other panels that's going to come on. We started slightly late, partly so everyone could come into the room. I think quite clearly, you know, this is not long enough to really discuss the full issues and full extent that there may be risks or not within football, but some of the key issues seem to be, obviously it comes up time and time again, but education, how the clubs are doing it, some issues around whereabouts and administration compliance, recreational drug use, and the risk of supplements and third parties. I thought there's some excellent questions from the audience, which you haven't had time to go into, but you could have a whole panel discussion on the merits of TUEs. Again, Russia's been covered so much, we thought it'd be quite refreshing you know, to actually look at some of the other issues rather than get distracted with the Russia. We kind of intentionally didn't avoid it, but thought that'd be something we could leave to the Q&As. And then one of the things that we haven't had a chance to really go into, which we wanted to, was the medical issues, one around privacy, while their data's being stored, which was relating to the Fancy Bears stuff. So there's some of the things we didn't get discussed. Thank you for being a wonderful audience and for asking some fantastic questions. Please can give me a very warm round of applause for an excellent panel.